Great to see a bunch of regulars in the room here. John, great to have you here. John Palish, great to have you here.
Okay, great. I'm gonna kick us off. So today's webinar is on data, how we're using data in the apprenticeship world, and what we can do to improve it. So I'm going to talk through a preview of some research we've been working on in the past few weeks, and then we've got a panel of brilliant speakers who we're going to bring in, and then we'll open up for some Q&A at the end. Just to say a bit upfront about why AFA is interested in this, why we think this is important in the apprenticeship growth agenda. Firstly, from an advocacy perspective, we need really high quality data to make the case for growing apprenticeships. And then, secondly, from kind of a more operational perspective, at the moment, we think we've got, quite a high burden of data collection and monitoring in the system. It's quite manual, and for programs to scale, apprenticeships to expand, we need it to be more streamlined and more useful for those programs. And then thirdly, from a research perspective, we need our colleagues in the research world to be able to effectively evaluate what's working, what are the kind of key policy levers. So yeah, lots of different interests here. So I'm gonna kick off with a bit of a summary of our research, and I'm just gonna share some slides. Great. So yeah, so over the past few months, we've been running a project looking at the national apprenticeship data ecosystem. We tried to do three things in this work. Firstly, just kind of descriptive, what's going on out there, what are the different kind of systems that people are using, how do those systems interact, who are different users and consumers of data. Then we wanted to look at the challenges, what are the difficulties that people are experiencing, what are those kind of most common problems, and what are the impact of those challenges. And finally, we made some recommendations that can help move us forwards a little bit, make some progress. Just to say a bit on scope. So firstly, our report is fairly high level. We're focusing on the kind of large scale systems, like how are people using rapids and whips. We're not going into kind of particular data points. There's other great work out there doing that. So yeah, we sort of mainly focus on what the national picture looks like. And secondly, we've concentrated on registered apprenticeships. We were quite interested to see what we could find out on unregistered apprenticeships, but really struggled to kind of find a way in there data-wise for obvious reasons. Just on methodology, so we did a big kind of review of all the documentation we can find, any previous research on data. There's a bit of relevant work. Pulled together all the kind of like bulletins, policy documents, any data dictionaries, things like that we could get our hands on, and then ran a series of focus groups and interviews with all the kind of different interested parties here. So intermediaries and sponsors, state and federal officials, researchers, employers, trade associations, labor associations, to get like a range of different perspectives, triangulate those views. So I'm going to give a really high level kind of summary of what the report says. The report should be coming out in the next week or so. We'll share it around our email list and put it on our website. So the first bit of the report sets out, what are those kind of key systems and users? How have they changed over time? How do they interact? What are people using them for? Obvious main one there is Rapids. So Rapids is our key kind of case management system for the registration process for apprenticeships, for all Office of apprenticeship registrations and most SAAs. So it's a key kind of regulatory tool. It's also become over time our kind of public accountability and transparency system. That's the main source of national data, and it is a key tool for researchers. We also looked at the states that have developed their own systems for apprenticeships. So that's at least 11 states, and also DC as well have got their own apprenticeship data systems. The report looks at kind of why states do this, why they're choosing to develop their own system and not use Rapids, what they can do differently. We've got David Polk from Wisconsin on our panel later, who's going to talk about this from his perspective. And then for any of you who are recipients of DOL grants, you'll be very familiar with WIPs. We looked at the interaction between Rapids and WIPs for any apprenticeship programs receiving federal dollars. They'll also be entering information into WIPs. We looked at the crossover, which is quite interesting. So of the 101 data points that you need to enter into WIPs if you've got a grant, there's around 31 that are very similar to the information that's already in Rapids, but often have kind of slightly, subtly different definitions, things like that, which can make it tricky and more burdensome. One really interesting area we looked at briefly is at the state level, states have started to integrate their apprenticeship data into their kind of data systems for education and workforce data on a longitudinal basis. We think this is really promising. So you can use this to get information. You can track wages for apprenticeship participants over time. So this could be really, really powerful in the future. And finally, kind of the US military apprenticeships, they're treated slightly separately. It's got its own database. Those are now integrated in Rapids. That's a recent development. Onto what we found on challenges. There's a lot in here in the report. I think this was quite a kind of cathartic experience for the people that we interviewed and spoke to. I would say, before we get onto those challenges, start with the positives. There's been loads of progress recently, kind of over the last decade, just to highlight a few of those. Firstly, last year was the first time we had a truly kind of national picture of what's going on in apprenticeships, when all states and the US military program data from that is integrated into Rapids. There's still some issues on accuracy and data quality, but we have a fully national data system now, which is great progress, and it's been a lot of work on that. I'd say, especially comparing internationally, there's actually in usual times pretty good level of transparency. So Rapids data is available monthly. We have public dashboards where you have state by state data, and researchers can access the Rapids database. That the fact that it's updated monthly is great. In the UK we publish data annually, so we've got kind of nearly real-time data. That's not currently being updated, which is an issue, but hopefully we get back to that. We've also seen recently the development of lots of tech solutions that make it easier for programs, especially when they've got complex compliance requirements, to manage that. We've got Philip Minardi on our panel later, who's going to be talking about the work that Buildwithin do. And finally, similar point to transparency. There's been great progress for researchers, especially in getting their hands on data. So, 10 years ago, you would have had to do a freedom of information request to get anything. Now, a lot of that data is available for researchers. On the challenges that we found, and, sort of despite that progress, there's a lot remaining to be done. I think the thing that came across really overwhelmingly from everyone we spoke to is that this is just a really fragmented system. You're dealing with different systems, different kind of definitions within those systems, there's not a lot of continuity within that. If you think about, take an example of a large employer running a program across multiple states, they're going to be reporting information into Rapids, maybe into a few different state systems. Maybe they have some federal grants, they're doing grant reporting separately from that. All of those things are run quite separately, and we don't really have kind of oversight or governance over that. That is really, increasing the administrative burden on data quite a lot. It's manual. It's sort of by nature of the design of the apprenticeship world, as opposed to data specifically, but that is creating a real barrier to program scaling up. We also found, communication was an issue. Often programs, intermediaries and sponsors who are dealing with this day to day had, different understandings of what information is actually collected, the definitions of things. We found 3 different data dictionaries for Rapids with slightly different interpretations of fields, and we don't have kind of one source of the truth there. Data quality, I think, is something that almost everyone recognizes as an issue. So to give a few examples here, we still have disparity between state data and national data. So if you look at kind of a state dashboard, it's often different to what's in Rapids, although this has been getting better with more recent data. We've still got an issue here. And then we've just got issues with the way data is collected through registration forms. There can be a lot of kind of challenges with data entry, different definitions. To take an example, anyone who's ever tried to do any, look at apprenticeships by industry, it's very easy. There's a lot of, for example, construction programs registered as education programs in Rapids. So we don't have a good kind of record of that. Scope of data came up quite a lot. There's a lot of areas where we don't have information. Either we don't collect or we don't sort of collate that information in a useful way. So for example, about, the credentials that apprentices are getting alongside their apprenticeship, how apprenticeships are financed, information on the kind of quality and structure of training. I would caveat this, apprenticeships is a voluntary program. Almost all of this data is coming from employers. We can't just collect more information from employers to solve this. Technology, we heard of a lot of kind of really promising developments, but often awareness and adoption and access is a bit low. So an example of this is e-signatures. It's possible to use an e-signature for everything now, but there's a lot of places where we're still requiring wet signatures, which is obviously adding a lot of steps to the program. And to give a bit of a sense of the consequences of all this, and the scale of administrative burden, we spoke to one large employer who reported they were spending about 1,500 hours of staff time each year on data collection, monitoring, reporting. Simply put, that's time that's not being spent on program improvement or growing a program. So yeah, lots of issues we picked up. Final thing the report does is pull together some recommendations, potential solutions that will help these problems. As we concentrated on the kind of national system, lots of these are things within DOL's gift. We tried to look a little bit at other actors in the system as well. Just to highlight a couple of these, I think we made about 21 in total. Firstly, just on that kind of fragmented system, we think there's a need to bring together these different stakeholders, try and have some governance and have those different voices in the same room when we're looking to improve the data system. So we think there should be a sort of national data advisory council or group that should work together on shared data standards, look at how to kind of bring some of these developments together, set out a roadmap for how we move forwards. On data quality, there's been loads of progress on data validation, especially in the last few years. We think this could go further. So we think DWell could introduce some data validation at the point of entry, so we identify data errors before they get into the system, rather than trying to fix them afterwards. We're going to talk a bit later about the kind of progress with software solutions, apprenticeship management software. We think this is a really important tool solution that can really help programs, especially large, complex programs that are kind of reporting in different ways. This should be an allowable use of funding. Paying for your data infrastructure should be an allowable use of funding for public and philanthropic funders. We also thought a bit about what we AFA can do as a trade association in that space, and how we can fill some of the data gaps where we don't want to introduce loads of required reporting, increase the burden on employers. We're going to think about, can we run some semi-regular large-scale surveys of intermediaries to get some insights on that on the intermediary and program level. There's some of those data gaps that we can fill through surveys, and potentially can we then use that to create some benchmarking tools that can help people assess their programs. Final one to highlight here: the report touches on some of the work that's going on in the kind of wider architecture around non-degree credential data. So there's really interesting projects with WorkCred, Credential Engine, and CredLens, building up the data architecture for those kind of providers, programs, individuals. We think apprenticeship should very much be in that conversation, be seen as a credential within those systems. That gives us a really useful architecture we can slot into. Being part of that world would help fill a lot of our kind of current data gaps and issues without creating extra burden. So that was a quick summary of what we found in our work and what the report says. The report should be out in a few weeks. We'll send it around. Please get in touch if you've got any questions, suggestions for further work, things that we should be collectively thinking about. I'm now going to pass over to Sarah, who's the co-author of our report and is going to help moderate this panel.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, folks. Hi, I'm Sarah Oldmingson. I'm a consultant at Apprenticeships for America, and it's been my privilege to collaborate with Harry on this work for the past 6 months. I'm pleased to be able to connect all of you with a couple of different perspectives on apprenticeship data to dig deeper into some of the issues that Harry raised for us in the introduction. So let me go ahead and get started by introducing our panelists. Can each of you just spend a moment introducing yourself, talking a little bit about the multiple hats that you wear that have a connection to apprenticeship data, and then share one of your apprenticeship pain points with the group. So Daniel, let me kick it off with you.
Sure. I'm Daniel Kuehn. I'm a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, where I study apprenticeship and other workforce development programs. And I'm also an adjunct professor at George Washington University. One of the things that I do at the Urban Institute with apprenticeship is direct the Apprenticeship Research Network, which is sort of a quarterly seminar series for apprenticeship researchers. I think there's a lot of forums for intermediaries and advocates in the apprenticeship space, but this was really a gap. So we're happy to do that on a regular basis. And I think one of my biggest pain points is data. So this is, this is the perfect venue to talk about that and dig into it more.
Great. We'll come back to you in just a minute. Philip, let's go to you next.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And first off, thank you, Harry, for bringing us all here together today to talk about this important topic. Just by way of introduction, my name is Philip Minardi. I have the unique pleasure of being one of the co-founders here at Buildwithin. Ostensibly, we're a skills innovation technology company that does predominantly 3 things. We help companies, organizations, nonprofits with intake and eligibility through our WeOA Go technology platform, which streamlines everything related to WeOA and other federal programs. We are also an apprenticeship management technology platform, and then also a skills matching and assessment technology platform using AI and machine learning. So basically, apprenticeships in a box. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit more here this morning. I would say maybe 2 pain points. I'm going to follow the lead here, Daniel, and say, obviously, we're here to talk about data. Data continues to be a key pain point, not just from a technology company perspective, but from an employer perspective. And then I would also say, following on the theme of employer education and adoption, we're at, I would say, a pretty critical point in the evolution of the model, where you have a lot of investment, a lot of attention around apprenticeships, but continuing to lower the barrier for employers around understanding the model and adopting the model is continuing to be a pain point for us.
Yeah, and lowering that border, of course, requires making data easier to work with and to report on. David, let's go to you next.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me. Sarah, thank you for having me, Harry. My name is David Polk. I have the distinct honor of serving as current president of the National Association of State and Territorial Apprenticeship Directors. And for my day job, I am the current director of apprenticeship for the great state of Wisconsin, the nation's oldest state apprenticeship agency.
Thanks, David.
And if to add on to the context around data, we're one of the 11 states that has our own proprietary developed data system here in Wisconsin. We've gone through some recent updates that enabled us to commingle that data with our youth apprenticeship system and our certified pre-apprenticeship system, so we're able to track participants. But one of the things that Harry alluded to is that the apprenticeship system overall is a volunteer system. So it's very, very tough to parse data that is not necessarily required, but it would be great for us to know. We sent out just a customer survey, customer satisfaction survey earlier this year, and we did pretty well by getting back about 40% of respondents, when normally you probably get back 10 to 15% when sending out a random survey. But it's still very tough to garner data that is not required by our specific system that would be very, very useful in our execution here in our state and responding nationally.
Yeah, David, that's a great point. One of the things that we came across in some of our research was the very low rate of response to inquiries about folks' disability status during the registration process. And of course, that is a voluntary piece of data that folks don't have to answer, but it does thwart our ability to understand the degree to which people with disabilities are being served by the system. So that's a great thing to lift up. Daniel, let's kick it off with you. So obviously data very important to the research and evaluation community. To kick us off on a positive note, can you reflect a little bit on some of the advances that have been made in terms of the types of data that you've been able to use in the last decade?
And just to understand how I use data as a researcher, I use Rapids, WIPs, and other data that's been submitted by sponsors and other data providers. Sometimes I use it in very raw form. Sometimes it's been more processed by the Department of Labor. But for Rapids, it's always an endpoint perspective. And there's been so many advances in Rapids, it's easy to forget that there are still a lot of challenges compared to what it was 10 years ago. So when I was working on my dissertation with Bob Lehrman a little over 10 years ago, as Harry alluded to, the official process was to submit a FOIA request and just wait for the data. And sometimes you waited a long time. Once I got it, it was missing SAA states that didn't use Rapids, which of course is a huge portion of apprentices and programs. And as AFA details in the new report, as of 2024, most of these states are now incorporated. So when I talk about Rapids, I'm thinking of what that looks like at the end. Even if you think of yourself, you're not a Rapids state, it all looks the same in the data that we receive now. So that isn't a big change from program perspective, I imagine, but it's a huge change from the perspective of research. And then I don't have any hard numbers on data entry errors, but my impression is that I used to have to do a lot more cleaning of values that were clearly typos or errors 10 years ago. than I do now. And that's never a great situation to be in because I
Mhm.
think the cleaning we do is pretty reasonable. I think it makes sense, but you can always get something wrong. So it's much better for data to come in and be high quality in the first place than have researchers and other end users make those decisions about cleaning.
And what about some challenges that still persist that kind of thwart some of your efforts?
Yeah, one challenge that you just mentioned that's always the top of my list that hasn't budged is missing information. And I think of this as especially a problem on race, ethnicity, and disability status.
Mhm.
So I think missing race is hung somewhere between 15 and 20% of apprentices, and that's been persistent. There hasn't been many big changes in that. And then missing disability status is a whole lot higher. And I think I always try to keep in mind, this is their right to report that. I can understand why it's sensitive information that they don't report. And so it's a tricky problem to solve, but it does introduce challenges in using data to help the communities that we're hoping to help. Another big challenge is that Rapids doesn't, it only identifies the apprentices programs. It doesn't identify employers. And obviously in a lot of cases, those two organizations are one and the same, but in a lot of cases they aren't. So I think from a process management system perspective, that's exactly what needs to be collected. But from a research perspective, so much of the apprenticeship happens with the employer. It would be great to know their employers. But the biggest challenge, I think, is the scope of it. And again, from a process management perspective, it makes sense that Rapids is limited to the apprenticeship period. But as a researcher, I would really like to know what happened before the apprenticeship, and especially what happens after the apprenticeship, the long-term earnings and education experiences of the apprentice, because we want to know how this affected their lives, right? So those data can be linked, but it's a real arduous process to be linked. And in some cases, if the data is sensitive, you can't get it linked. And I think DOL probably has some capacity to do that data linking, so it doesn't add burden here. But that's a major gap of Rapids as it currently exists.
Yeah, I think you're lifting up an important kind of underlying challenge, which is that the Rapid system was really developed with a compliance framework in mind versus an outcomes framework. And increasingly, as we're really focused on growing apprenticeship in the United States, we need to have a better grasp on that outcomes piece, which is so critical. Daniel, can you wrap us up? What's on your wish list? Are there things that you'd like to be able to dig into from a research perspective that you currently can't because of data limitations?
I think it would be that long-term follow-up. And I would love to use Rapids to produce cause and effect estimates of apprenticeship on long-term outcomes. Earnings we focus on a lot, but also other outcomes. That would require tracking post-program experiences, or at least making it easier to link to federal wage records. And we actually do this on a lot of projects for apprenticeship, but we use WIPs or we use some other grant-specific data system that is easier to link. And that's great, but that's obviously limited to certain programs. And it would be great to be able to do similar things more easily for Rapids as a whole. So we could look at emerging sectors, we could look at whole states, we could look at the whole system. And that's something that hasn't been done in a long time because of these challenges.
Thank you. So David, let me shift over to you for a state perspective. So you mentioned a moment ago, you wear hats both with Wisconsin as well as with NASTAD. So from your Wisconsin perspective, can you talk to us a little bit about why some states are building their own state level data systems for apprenticeship? What are some of the benefits of that, and what do they offer that Rapids doesn't?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons. One of the things is, when we're a state that developed our own system, so we don't use a packaged CMS that was purchased and then layer it on top of our state data. So because we built our own system 10 to 15 years ago, those nuanced upgrades that we have to make to our system are done in-house, in small improvement projects, in order to either garner data or solicit data requests to our stakeholders. All of those things are done entirely in-house by our IT team. The larger projects that we have to pay for, of course, we have to find the funds within our state or use other grant funds to then wholly upgrade our system. And I'll give an example. One of the things that Daniel alluded to in his answer, we updated our system a few years ago where we layered in our youth apprenticeship data. So we're able to track a youth apprentice all the way through the registered apprenticeship process if they are to become a registered apprentice. One of those data points you can find on our website in our year in review from last year. Just last year, over 11.5% of youth apprenticeship participants had gone into registered apprenticeship. That number has grown significantly every single year. And because we did that update, we're also able to track certified pre-apprenticeship participants who then engage in our system. So our specific apprenticeship data is very easily accessible within our data team, but we're also able to work with our economists to then extrapolate that data. So we're able to go into the internally, of course, go into the WIOA data to see if a participant that is a registered apprentice had participated in a WIOA program prior to becoming a registered apprentice. And those same economists are able to track that those individual earnings. Now, that data parsing, of course, is outside of my bureau in apprenticeship, but we're able to track all of that in-house, and that's a benefit of developing our own CMS internally. So I think that's one of the reasons that states are going that route, and they're able to prescribe the data that they're requesting from their individual stakeholders in their state.
Yeah, that's great. And to your point, I think those on-ramps into registered apprenticeship are really important for us to better understand, as well as we're thinking about opportunities to expand more generally. What have been some of your challenges as a state director?
So again, the funding to wholly upgrade our system, we have to find that. And sometimes that takes a bit of time. Our IT team is, they're not specific for my Bureau of Apprenticeship. They're for the entirety of the Department of Workforce Development. And sometimes they're busy. A lot of times they're busy. So then upgrades to our data system can take some time to do that. So internally here in Wisconsin, those are some of the hurdles. And then again, as a state director and a former apprenticeship participant, I really wish that we could require more data from our stakeholders, from our apprentices. But again, it's a volunteer system, and we have to tread very, very lightly on what we prescribe that would be a burden versus us able to get some very, very useful data and having those stakeholders participate in garnering that data.
Yeah, and I think you're also calling out an interesting area for growth, which is that we know within the private sector, there have been a lot of innovations in terms of ability to cull data without having to ask people to submit it themselves, right? And I think thinking about opportunities for automation and how to capture more data from a wider range of resources so people aren't having to manually report it feels like a really important space for innovation longer term. David, in some of our conversations with folks, we heard about divergent reporting requirements between what sponsors and employers are having to send to states versus the federal reporting requirements. Do you have any thoughts on how we could help to better align that and to help to reduce that challenge and burden for practitioners?
I'll start with us as a state pushing our data up to OA. You'll notice if you were to go to our website or go through our year in review that the data that DOL had reported or has reported for Wisconsin is a bit different than the data that you'll see on our website or our year in review. And that's because sometimes uploading that data, specific data points don't necessarily talk to each other. So once they're put into Rapids, they don't count it at all. So I think that there could be a bit more system symmetry where there could be a call to some of those data gaps or individual data gaps, the stick number gaps, where we could absolutely get those data points input or either push it back to us to at least ask, this isn't showing up in our system, so on and so forth, so that we can at least fix those data points at our level and then push the data back up. When it comes to requirement of our stakeholders, I think a development of a bit less burdensome. To your point, making it just that much easier to cull that data from our stakeholders, and also giving them that charge of what we can do with the data. We can see where their recruiting is coming from. We can see where there are gaps where they could be recruiting from a certain part of the state, or certain high schools that have low participation in our system, and there could be an opportunity for recruitment. So I think if we're able to signal to them how we can use the data, how they could use us to parse data and use it within their program, it could make it a bit less burdensome or give them a bit of a charge to participate. Um, but outside of that, just making it easier, push button, just as easy as doing that survey on the back of your receipt when you go grocery shopping, in order to garner that data, just making it easier so that we all benefit from it.
That's great. Any other thoughts on how national data infrastructure could better support state needs?
I think funding for states to upgrade their particular systems in a way that the systems talk to each other better. And also, at least specifically for us 11 states that have our own CMSs, I think there could be a project for us to work directly with them, with our IT teams, with our data teams, work with them directly to kind of fill those gaps so the data is more accurate.
Thank you. And I will flag, we're going to come back in a few minutes and have some time for Q&A at the end of the call. So if folks have questions, you're welcome to drop them in the chat, or we can open it up here in a little bit. But let me go now to Philip. So Philip, you're in a unique position, as you mentioned earlier. You both, your organization both offers an AMS, but also serves as an intermediary for apprenticeships. So let's start by talking a little bit about that AMS hat. What are some of the apprenticeship data challenges that you've tried to mitigate with your product? And how has the national data infrastructure landscape helped or hindered those efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I amazed at how aligned David, Daniel, and I are in terms of some of the challenges. But really, Buildwithin here, we do multiple hats. So yes, we're a technology company. Yes, professional services, but we've also been grantees, so have had to deal with the whips of the world. And we've run apprenticeships here internally at Buildwithin as well. So seen it from the employer perspective. And really, we built our technology platform around kind of, let's call it, four big challenges that we see in particular from employers, from nonprofits, from government entities. And number one, and David kind of mentioned it, is the burdensome barrier. So the challenge, if you talk to any employer today or any nonprofit, is this seems like a whole lot of work. So lowering the barrier to getting employers kind of into the model has been number one. Number two is, as we enrich data, as we get more access to data, as we get to leverage data, it's easier for us as a community to show the ROI, to show the value of the model. What is an employer getting by choosing the apprenticeship model versus another type of on-the-job training or employment mechanism? So number three is decision making. I think one of the things that gets lost in a lot of the conversations we have about kind of national data and how do we approach it from a federal perspective or from a state perspective is just the power that data has to give employers decision-making ability. So to understand, how should we be approaching this model? How should we be approaching hiring? How should we be approaching competency development? And then lastly, obviously, one of the issues du jour is compliance. So whether it's a grant or whether it's just having your standalone program, having an enriched set of data and tracking mechanisms is super powerful when you're talking about compliance. So the Buildwithin technology platform kind of brings all of that under one technology stack. So from understanding kind of skills analysis, what types of skills would work well for different roles, to being directly integrated. We talked about APIs. So we're one of the first technology companies that has a direct integration with Rapids. So whereas a traditional company, it may take, 90 days to get up and running. Because of that direct integration, it cuts that down to 90 minutes. So everything from kind of tracking the competencies, the OJT, the RTI hours. We talked a little bit earlier about longitudinal outcomes. Super, super important as we look at the long tail value of apprenticeships, understanding kind of the top of the funnel, getting the right people into the right roles, then where are they going after the apprenticeship? How is that impacting their long-term job outlook, their family sustaining wages? Kind of having all of that under one roof within one technology stack gives us an immense amount of power. And I would say none of this is really possible without the partners that we deal with on a regular basis. So folks like the NRAEF, the National Restaurants Association, to ESEPs, when you're talking about early childhood education and getting more teachers and getting more early educators into the apprenticeship model, to big enterprises like United Airlines that uses Buildwithin to manage their IT apprenticeship program. Kind of having access to an enriched set of data at every point of that journey for an apprentice and for a program is incredibly powerful and obviously very helpful as we look at adoption long tail.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So as an intermediary, you have a lot of firsthand experience now with data tracking and reporting requirements at the federal level. Do you have any lessons learned from that experience? Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen?
Yeah, it's been interesting because tracking skills growth, the competency development, kind of the longitudinal long tail kind of data sets for individual apprentices and for programs gives us a lot of insight into kind of what is happening across the market. And I think the first thing would be the importance of the first 3 months of an apprenticeship program. So as you look at the data, kind of the success metrics of an apprentice or program really are tied towards that first 30, 60, 90 days. So having a really powerful mentor, and manager combination is really critical to a program being successful. So what does that mean? Having data and having a lot of touch points early on in the apprenticeship leads to better outcomes. So I would say focusing on that is super, super helpful. Then I would say the one big takeaway here, the lesson learned at least from us over the last few years is everyday data isn't tracked. Every day you're not tracking in a very macro and micro level. The OJT, the RTI, the competency development over time is a day lost. So just being very, very focused on tracking as much data, keeping it as automated as humanly possible from the very beginning, and also making sure it's real time is critically important to not only the viability of a program, but garnering those insights that are going to make it more successful over time.
Thanks. So let me open it up to all three of you with a couple of closing questions before we shift over to Q&A here. First, if you could offer one recommendation to the Department of Labor on how to improve apprenticeship data at the federal level, what would your suggestion be?
I would say,
David,
yeah, I'll start. I and my state's memberships, we're open to working, directly to at least work on the parts that we can solve with regard to data calling depth and data uploading. I think that would be a huge development for most people on this call to at least be able to get accurate data, specifically from DOL, without coming to a state. So I would lead with that. Like we're absolutely open to working directly to kind of solve those first hurdle holes that there are in the data reporting.
thanks, Sue. Daniel, I
So-
saw you come off too.
Yeah, I think they regularly link data sources or support us in linking data sources to the National Directory of New Hires, which is the federal wage records. They can do this regularly and should do this regularly, linking Rapids to the National Directory of New Hires and making that available in some form. It's sensitive, it might have to be aggregated, but in some form. doesn't add burden to sponsors, doesn't add burden to states, doesn't change the system. It does take a little work to get those agreements and linkages in place, but it would be a huge benefit.
And Daniel, for folks who are less familiar with the National Directory of New Hires, could you give just a 30-second explanation of what that is and what it could do?
So states collect wage record information for the unemployment insurance system, and they report that up to the federal government initially to manage child support payments, which is why it's called the National Directory of New Hires. HHS maintains it, and it's frequently used for research purposes, so we don't have to run to every single state and link the wage records in every single state. And it's currently used on other apprenticeship research projects supported by DOL. But it does stay, it's sensitive, so it's an effort to access and use.
Yeah,
Philip.
I would say, Sarah, I think like in just pulling a thread from Daniel and David, I think it really, and maybe it's not one recommendation, but maybe it's tying two together. You know, there's a lot of entities out there right now that are collecting robust sets of data, whether it's intermediaries, sponsors, and I think it kind of pulls on the tail of what is in Harry's recommendations from AFA, which is a USDOL-led working group of some of these individuals, organizations that already have built very robust sets of data. And I think getting them around one table to talk about who has what, where, how, why, I think would be a valuable use of time and resources. So I would say, some sort of working group of tech leaders that are pulling some of these data systems together already might be warranted. And then pulling on the thread of kind of where are we housing all this data and how can we pull this together? So I think at some point there's going to have to be a conversation around how do we get a centralized, anonymized national data repository, or in tech speak, a data lake, where we can capture some of these data metrics, OJT, RTI, longitudinal outcomes, and start to understand how can we use them more effectively and efficiently.
Thanks, Philip. And I think that melds nicely with the other recommendation that Harry mentioned, which is also thinking about this apprenticeship data within the larger workforce data ecosystem as well, and thinking about how things like LARs and how we're tracking non-degree credentials are all linked together effectively as well. So with that, I will go ahead and say thank you so much to our panelists, and thanks to all of you who are on the line today who weighed in and participated in interviews and surveys and conversations with us over the past couple months. I will hand things back over to Harry and we'll open up Q&A.
Brilliant, thank you, Phil, Daniel, and David. I really like the terminology of data lake. I've heard that before. It's a good one. We're going to open this up for Q&A. So if you've got any questions for us or the panel, please put your hand up or put a question in the sidebar. While people are thinking of questions, can I pick on you, Josh Laney, to expand on your point about updating the Rapids coding system, what that means?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. The Rapids numbers don't mean anything to anybody except people in Rapids. And it's hard when we try to work across state systems or national systems and tied to ONET or tied to other workforce development activities. And they also, for states that are Rapids users, have a tendency to force people to misclassify occupations because they're such limited numbers. So the data that you get out is not great because folks are wedging things in to occupations that just aren't right. And then the other part of that is again, a Rapids specific issue is the way that somebody mentioned earlier that the employers are not tracked, the sponsors are tracked, but the employers are in there. It just means that the states have to really make a focus. So, pushing on the sponsors, if it's a group program and you got 50 employers, they got to be in there and you got to attach the apprentices to them. If you do that, you get good data out, but it's not mandatory when you set them up that the apprentices be attached to an employer. So a lot of times you find that they're just not hooked to an employer. That ought to just be just switched on. Nobody's an apprentice if they don't have an employer. So they should all just have to be attached to an employer. And I understand, we've got labor partners that bring them in and they're in their system first, and then they get sent out to different employers. So I get the logistics of why it's that way, but it also, everybody who is an apprentice has an employer. So I would hook them to that. And then last thing on that is related, the the NAICS code assignments go by the sponsor, it just ruins our data. In Alabama, where I've been working for the past several years, is we've got tons of group sponsors that are community colleges and universities. And so it looks like we got a whole bunch of people working in the community college and university industry when they might be training in whatever. They're just getting their sponsorship and their related instruction to the community college and university. So that's my top three like to-do list on Rapids.
In addition to the community colleges, JATCs have a NAICS code that's an education code. And I think some of them use construction codes, but a bunch of them use the education code. So it just looks like you've got a huge education industry, and it's just not true. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. Completely agree with those 3 points. Joe Paul, can I ask you to expand on your point on data quality, the issues we've got there?
I would say that it starts with the inability of the Rapid system to have data validation. We understand why they built it, because they didn't want to make too many restrictions or too many ways for people to have a reason not to put in their data. And by loosening up the standards, they also made the data quality questionable. And by also not making enough fields mandatory, they've made it so that the data sets themselves are not as complete as they should be. As part of our analysis through our Center of Excellence grant, we had to move from a data analysis standpoint to a data quality standpoint in order to do what we needed to do to tell the Department of Labor of the data that we were looking at.
Thanks, Joe. And CSG is doing some great work on data quality. Owen has asked a question in the sidebar that I'm going to address to you, Dan, because you touched on it earlier, which isn't the most useful data about what happens to apprentices after their training.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point I was making, that we would love to track. We want it, of course, it's important the wages they earn in the program, completion of the program, but the reason why you do an apprenticeship is because of the rest of your career, right? So having data on that. And that's real hard for sponsors to track. I don't think that is something, it's not so much that Rapids needs to change as the system and how the LOL uses it.
Great. And we've got a question from John in the sidebar, which is, wouldn't it make sense for DOL to build a free to use but not required case management system for apprenticeships? Essentially have one universal system across all states. David, I can see you shaking your head. I'll let you come in a second. I would say from our perspective, there's definitely, if you think about the pain points for especially for large employers working across multiple states, there's definitely a lot of sense to having a single universal system. That's how it works in the UK. It's one centralized system. But that's a far simpler world where you have one funder, one set of standards. In our current regulatory approach, it'd be pretty difficult to do that and work within what is a very state-based system. David, I'll let you come in on that as well.
Yeah, you led into why that wouldn't quite work here, and I'll use it as some of the updates that we've been able to make in our state. Very specifically, a big national system, free to use system, wouldn't necessarily prescribe to how we want to parse our data specifically as our state. So if we were to use that, then there may be limitations that we would love to execute, but we will be using this free resource from DOL. So I actually don't think that's a good idea at all.
I would just add. Sorry, John, I'd just
No, go
quickly
ahead.
add, perhaps there's a halfway house, David, even in a world where states got their own systems and own requirements, 60, 70% of that is going to be very similar. So there's maybe a halfway world where we can make some progress, where we have, state compacts to get that universal element where everything should be the same. John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I appreciate the initiative David took in building their own system, but he touched on the pain point for me or any state director of any workforce program, which is, okay, I built it. Now, how do I keep it updated? Because what is going to happen, and we saw this with the consortia model and WIOA, we saw it with the UI systems, is governors are happy to build a new system and cut the ribbon and make the announcement, but 3 or 4 years later, they're not happy to give you 8 or 10 or 12 or $15 million to update that system. My argument has always been DOL's ETA sitting on $10.2 billion a year. How hard is it for the assistant secretary to find 50 or 100 million? It's not hard at all. So they could keep that system updated. They wouldn't run into the challenges of trying to track down improvements for the system. One improvement could be made in one system rather than 53 different systems. We saw the pain of that during the pandemic with the UI systems. DOL issues guidance, 53 IT teams then have to go crack open their system and try to fix it. I understand there's trust issues with the government having all this, and I think, unfortunately, those are only going to get worse over the next 4 years as we see what happens with national data. But I will still stick to the belief that if DOL can build something that is, and it wouldn't be built in a vacuum, it would be built with input from states, from partners like Buildwithin, and Philip, please don't tell Michelle I said this or else she's going to shoot me. We can have lots of people at the table, and we can build something that is good enough for most. And if Wisconsin or somebody wants to build their own and have their own data and go ahead. But my fear is we're not just trying to serve states here, we're trying to serve employers. And if employers are scared away by the model, which I think after 90 years of apprenticeships in this country, we have to admit they're afraid of the model. We've got to try to make it easier for them. We've got to try to get them in. And if there's a way we can do that with limiting the regulations by creating something, I don't know, like the IRAP program that is less burdensome on employers, if we can reduce the data burden, if we can reduce the data collection, if we can reduce the case management burden, I'm just trying to, we've been trying to sell this model and it's not working. Everybody got pretty excited about the executive order that talked about 1 million new apprentices. DOL issued the exact same agency goal in 2018 of 1 million new apprentices. This isn't anything new. We just dusted it off and announced it again. Everybody said, oh my God, look at the president is so engaged with apprenticeships. He was 10 years ago, 8 years ago. We had a task force, we had a report, we had all this stuff. And we're right back at the same place. So I think we've got to fundamentally change the way we're coming at this problem. I don't think tweaking around the edges is going to get us where I think we all want to be. I think everybody on this call believes in the model, believes it works. We've got to figure out a way to sell it to the employers, because that's where it's breaking down.
I think there's a lot there, John, that we can all agree on. We all believe in the model, and we all know we need to reduce the barriers for employers to accessing the model. We might just differ on how we get there. David, I'm going to let you have a very quick final word on this before I close out.
I find that as a very interesting take, because the same hurdle that was just described that would affect states implementing and updating their system is probably the same exact problem that we would have today with a big overarching national system that was described in that take. And also, as my comrade Josh alluded to in the chat, I don't know where I can find the thumbs down emoji for IRAPs, but we tried that experiment and it didn't increase apprenticeship participation at all. So I'll leave everyone with that.
Thanks, David. That's it. A good note to close on. thank you to our panel, being brilliant speakers, and to Sarah for moderating and co-authoring the report. We'll get the report out soon. Thanks everyone for coming. John's flagged a couple of other webinars we've got coming up next week on the rulemaking, on EO requirements, similar topic. And then in 2 weeks on workforce Pell. So look forward to seeing you there.